Greetings everybody, welcome back. Episode number 2. There's a typo here as well, I need to correct this. So episode number 2 of this course, where we are going to see how to implement a real application using TanStack Query in order to be able to communicate with the backend API. Now that we've got our backend API in place, it's time to start adding the code to our application using TanStack Query and see how we can, communicate with this backend API in order to fetch some, users and some posts. So setting up the first step when you want to start using TanStack Query is to set up your query client, right? So to use TanStack Query in your React application, we will need to create a query client instance and make it available to our components using the QueryClientProvider. So inside of your main JSX, right, what you are going to do is this: create a new query client, right? And of course, this is being captured into a query client const. I am importing query client and QueryClientProvider from TanStack React Query. These are the two items that you need to import, right? And then you are going to wrap your application using QueryClientProvider component, and you are going to specify the client using the object that you created here, right? And then you are going to also, if you want, set this initial is open for React Query DevTools. If you want, you can use React Query DevTools so that when you run the application in your browser, you see kind of what the DevTools can do for you. But if you want to have it in a closed state, you can set initial is open to false, right? So again, if I take you here, this is the application, end of episode 2, as you can see here. If I go to main.jsx, can close out these, you can see here that I am importing QueryClientProvider from React Query, TanStack Query. I am wrapping my app with QueryClientProvider, and I am specifying the client that I imported from here. So this is the first step when you want to start using TanStack Query, creating the query client, and that query client will be available to your components and will allow you to start communicating with your backend API. So this is what we already talked about. We wrap our app component with QueryClientProvider. We pass in the query client instance that we created. We also use React Query DevTools, and we set the initial state to false. The next step, of course, is to start creating pages for users and posts. If you remember, in the previous episode, we kind of talked about the backend API and the fact that we've got some users and posts that are somehow related, and we want to be able to fetch them, create new users, new posts, and so on. So let's create two new components, users page and posts page. These are the two components that we are going to create inside of the SRC folder. Take a look at the users page. Again, in the users page, as you can see here, I am importing use query. This is one of the hooks that TanStack Query provides, and as the name suggests, it allows you to query a backend API to fetch some data. So when you are fetching data, you use this hook, use query. When you are changing your backend data, you use mutations. I am going to show you how to do that. So use query is a hook, right? And this is a function that I have created for fetching users. If you are familiar with the fetch API, this is easy to understand. This is, as you can see, an asynchronous function. I am fetching my data from this endpoint, from this path, localhost, the port number / users. I am awaiting the fetch operation to complete, and then I am capturing the response into this variable, and I am checking if response is not okay, you can run this. Otherwise, you run this. This is the command that allows us to fetch some, users. This is simple. I mean, you need to be familiar with how to use fetch API. You could, of course, decide to use Axios here. It doesn't matter. I decided to use fetch. And then this is the start of your component. as you can see here, this is the start of your component, and this is the hook we are using, use query. There are two important things that I am setting here for the use query. You see this object? I am setting query key and I am setting query function. Query function is the same function that I created here, fetch users. I am going to talk about query key later. And then, as you can see here, using this hook, I am, destructuring this object, is loading error data. These are the different, let's say, states that we've got that we can use in order to construct our component. So first off, is loading is a flag that could be true or false, right? If it is true, I am going to render this paragraph tag. I am going to say that I am loading users. If error is true, I am going to say that I encountered some errors when I was trying to fetch the users, and this is the error message that I am going to print out. Error.message. Otherwise, if is loading is false, it means the loading operation is complete now. If the error is false, means that I didn't encounter any errors. Now I can use this data. So this data, of course, as the name suggests, contains the users that I got from the backend API, right? So let's see how I am using this. Take a look here. So I'm structuring a simple HTML table. Here inside of the body of the table, I am mapping through the data. For each user inside of our data, I am going to, print out the ID, the name, and the email. Very simple, right? So let me take you to my code here. Let's take a look at users page. And this is the exact code that I showed you. Let me tell you briefly what I am doing here again. The function that communicates with the backend API, this could do this. You could do this using Axios as well. The import for use query, the definition of the component, right? And then using the use query to capture these three flags. Is loading error not a flag, but the object, the data? I am going to talk about query key. Query function is the function that you created here, right? They're related. They're the same actually. It's a reference to that function. And then inside of the body of the component, first I am, checking these two flags. And then inside of the return statement, I am mapping through the data. And for each user, I am printing the ID, name, and email. So let's go to the notes. I have another page called posts page as well. I don't want to talk about this one thoroughly because it's very similar to the users page. And if you take a look here, it's exactly the same thing. So fetch posts, you are fetching your post from this endpoint, and then the component, again using the hook, destructuring the object, is loading error data. I am going to talk about the query key, query function, checking the flags, and then everything is okay, going through the data and, printing out the different properties of a post, ID, category ID, title, and author name. Now, the next step is to update our application.jsx, the app.jsx, in order to, of course, have these components in place. And this is, of course, what I have done here. So if I take a look here, you see that I have imported users page, posts page, and I'm good to go. Now I want to run the application and show you what I've got in action. Take a look here. So this is the application that we've got. It's running on localhost port 5173, and these are the tables that we've got for posts and for users. So we've got the category ID, we've got the ID of a post, we've got the title and author. And these are coming from the backend API. And if there is an error, right, when we want to communicate with the backend API, suppose that, for example, I come here to the users page, right, and I change this to 5002, and I run the application, and if I refresh, you see it says loading users. It is retrying. I don't want to, get into the details for now, but you can see that that paragraph loading users is being rendered here. This paragraph, I'm talking about this paragraph loading users. So if loading is true, then this paragraph will show. So if the backend API is probably slow, right? No worries, because your users can see this message and they will understand that something is happening. The application hasn't crashed. The application is trying to load some data from the backend API, but the backend API is probably slow. And it is still loading users. Of course, we can, configure this. And when there is an error, of course, we will see that, error fetching users and so on. So this is the simplest setup for using a TanStack query inside of your components, and loading users and handling errors and so on, and showing the posts, as you can see here. Let me get to the notes one more time, and talking about the next part of this episode's notes. So to test the loading and error features of TanStack query, let's temporarily modify the API endpoint in one of the fetch functions. So for example, I can change the endpoint, I can change the port number, and then I can see what happens. So if I change this to 5000, but if I, for example, change this to this, you see it says error fetching users, HTTP error, status not found. Why? Because the endpoint that we are communicating with doesn't actually exist. So this is the, loading users. Again, it is trying to load the user because I think I changed something. So it starts loading. It goes to that is loading state is true. And when the is loading cannot load the data, when the TanStack query cannot load the data, we've got an error, and the error that we've got is going to get rendered here. If error, print out the error message, and the error message is that this endpoint actually doesn't exist. That is the reason why we are getting a 404. Again, when you make a change to the application kind of restarts and then tries to fetch data from the backend, but it doesn't show the data, the users, because the endpoint doesn't exist. So this is one simple way to test whether is loading and error is working or not. When you run your application, you should see error fetching users message displayed on the users page. Don't forget to change the backend to the endpoint before continuing. Also, as I showed you, if you have a slow backend API, you can see that is loading is true, right? And the application will start loading data. You can also simulate this using throttling. Network throttling, using the network tab in your DevTools, in your browser's DevTools, to kind of simulate a slow internet connection, and then to see how the application tries to fetch data on a slow connection or a backend that is slow, and then after the fetching is complete, the data will show up. Let's talk a little bit about use query, the hook that we started using in this episode. The use query hook is the core data fetching in TanStack query. It allows you to declaratively fetch, cache, and manage the state of the asynchronous data in your React application. So we kind of talked about the use query hook, and I said that I'm going to talk about the query key later, and the query key has many advantages and it is very feature rich. You can control different things with it, like for example caching. So this is a unique key for your query, right? It's an array that identifies the data you are fetching. TanStack query uses this key for caching, for refetching, and for managing updates. For example, users is a key for fetching all users. It's an array, as I told you, so you could actually have more than one item here. And later we'll see keys like users, user ID. When we are fetching one single user, we need to set the users like this. So users and user key, user ID for fetching a specific user. A query function, I told you what the query function is. This is actually the asynchronous function that fetches data. It should return a promise that resolves with the data or rejects with an error. If you want to know more about promises, the good news is that I have a playlist for promises in JavaScript on my channel. So the query function, as you saw, we implemented the query function using fetch. So fetch returns like a promise. This query function has to return a promise that either resolves with the data or rejects with an error. In our example, we had fetch users, we had fetch posts, right? These are the query functions that we implemented using fetch API. And then the values that are returned from the use query hook, it returns an object containing several properties that provide the current state of your query. Is loading. We use this loading. It's a boolean indicating whether the query is currently fetching or not. Is error. Again, a boolean indicating whether the query has encountered an error. The error is the error object itself, right? If is error is true, you can get to the error using this object. Data, right? It's actually the data, the fetch data, if the query is successful. And then there are many other useful properties that we haven't used here, like is fetching, is stale, refetch, and so on. We will probably explore them later. So let's compare this technique with using something like fetch, Axios, or promises. When using promises and fetch or Axios directly, you typically need to manage the loading, the error states manually using useState in React. Again, it is very complicated. It involves a lot of boilerplate code compared to something like TanStack Query. You also need to handle caching and caching of data yourself, which is something that TanStack Query does for you out of the box. If you want to avoid redundant API calls, this often leads to more verbose and complex code. Advantages of using use query hook: automatic caching. So the data is cached automatically, right? You can stop the note here to read these, the video here to read these sentences yourself as well. So TanStack Query automatically caches fetch data based on the query key that we provided. I'm going to show you how that happens. This means that if you request the same data again within a certain amount of time, it will be served from the cache without making another API call based on the query key that you assign to that query. So the caching is done automatically. Background updates. So TanStack Query can refetch the data automatically in the background if the data becomes stale. So this ensures that the data that you are showing to the user in the UI stays up to date without requiring explicit user interaction. Simplify the state management. So with use query, a lot of complexities of state management, like loading, error, success, these states are managed for you. So this again reduces the amount of state management logic that you need to write in your components. Optimistic updates and mutations. So TanStack Query provides powerful tools for handling data mutations, like creating, updating, deleting data with features like optimistic updates, which improve the user experience. And of course, the DevTools that we haven't used so far, the DevTools is helps us to be able to debug the application. This is this episode, the conclusion of this episode. In this episode, we created these two pages, users page, posts page. We started using the use query hook in a very minimalistic approach. There are so many other things that we haven't used yet. We started using is loading, error, and data. And of course, using the use query, we have our backend API, and use query is a hook that allows us to be able to fetch some data from the backend. And you can use different techniques for the fetching part. You can use Axios, you can use fetch API. In our example, we are using fetch API. And that's it. In the next episode, we will continue talking about this. We will continue talking about the users page and the post page. We're going to probably implement a details page so that you can click on a details button for a single user, and then you will be taken to another page where you can see more information about a user, all using TanStack Query. And that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed watching this, guys, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend if you've got a friend who's learning about TanStack Query, and stay tuned for the upcoming videos as well. Bye-bye.